January 1957, Radio City Music Hall, Hollywood. Elvis Presley stands in front of a microphone about to record a ballad called Loving You for his second motion picture. He's 22 years old. He's sold more records in the past year than any artist in RCA's history. He has the #1 single, the #1 album, and a film contract worth nearly $500,000. But something in the room feels wrong. The song is gentle, romantic. Nothing like the performances that made him dangerous 12 months earlier. The film's producers are watching from the booth. Studio executives have notes. And Elvis, standing at the microphone with his band behind him, is being asked to sing in a way that feels foreign. He doesn't argue. He's too new to this, too young to recognize what's happening. But years later, the people in that room would describe it differently. They'd call it the day Elvis stopped being in control of his own sound. The day Hollywood realized it could reshape him into something safer, more profitable, more manageable. This is the story of Loving You, an album recorded at the exact moment the biggest rebel in American music began to disappear. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, one song at a time. And the question no one asks is, could he have stopped it, or was it already too late? 6 months earlier, Elvis Presley was untouchable. Heartbreak Hotel had spent 8 weeks at #1. His debut RCA album moved 1 million copies in its first year. When Ed Sullivan, who'd publicly called him vulgar, finally caved and booked him for television, 60 million people watched. His first appearance pulled an 82.6% share of the viewing audience, the highest in TV history at that point. Hollywood saw money. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, negotiated a 3-picture deal with Paramount Pictures. The first film, Love Me Tender, was rushed into production, a Civil War drama where Elvis played a supporting role and sang 4 songs. It made $4.5 million on a $1 million budget. But critics tore it apart. The New York Times said Elvis acted like he was waiting for a bus. Variety called the film a serviceable vehicle hampered by miscasting. Paramount wanted a do-over, not just another movie, a movie about Elvis. A story that could package his image, explain him to skeptical parents, turn rebellion into aspiration. The pitch was simple. Small-town boy discovers music, gets famous, stays humble, guided by a wise publicist, supported by a loving mother figure, wholesome, safe, controlled. They'd call it Loving You. And the soundtrack wouldn't just accompany the film, it would define it. But here's the tension buried in that plan. The Elvis that made teenagers scream was dangerous, unpredictable, sexual in a way that terrified adult America. The Elvis Paramount needed was charming, respectful, non-threatening. The album had to bridge that gap. And no one had figured out yet whether that was even possible. Recording began at Radio Recorders in Hollywood on January 15, 1957. Elvis brought his core band, Scotty Moore on guitar, Bill Black on bass, DJ Fontana on drums. The Jordanaires, professional session vocalists, were there for backup harmonies. This was familiar territory. But the studio was also filled with people Elvis didn't know. Session musicians hired by Paramount, arrangers brought in to elevate the sound, producers who answered to the film, not to the music. The first song was Got a Lotta Livin' to Do, an upbeat rocker written for an early scene in the film. It had drive, energy. Elvis felt loose. The band locked in fast. By the second take, they had it. Then came Loving You. The title track was a ballad. Slow, tender, orchestrated. The arrangement leaned heavily on strings. The Jordanaires hovered close in the mix, softening Elvis's voice with layered harmonies. He had to pull back his natural attack, croon instead of push. It wasn't bad. It was beautiful, actually. Professional, polished. But Scotty Moore noticed something. The spontaneity. The raw, first-take magic that had defined Elvis's early RCA sessions was being replaced by precision. They repeated takes not because something was wrong, but because it needed to match a specific vision, a vision that didn't come from Elvis. After the session, Scotty mentioned it to Bill Black. Nothing dramatic, just an observation. "Feels different," he said. Bill nodded. "Yeah, tighter." They didn't push it. Elvis seemed fine. The Colonel was happy. The producers were pleased, but something had shifted, and neither of them could name it yet. The tension wasn't in the studio. It was in the songs themselves. Hal Wallace, the film's producer, had given the songwriters clear instructions. Romance, optimism, charm. Nothing controversial. Nothing that would get the film banned in conservative markets. Nothing that would remind parents why they hated Elvis in the first place. The writers delivered. "Loving You" was sweet. "Lonesome Cowboy" leaned into soft Western imagery. "Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear" was almost childlike, a plea for affection wrapped in nursery rhyme simplicity. But Elvis had also chosen material that felt closer to his instincts. "Mean Woman Blues" had bite. A blues rocker with grit and swagger. "Hot Dog" was chaotic, wild, pure rockabilly energy. These were songs that could make a crowd lose control. The album became a split personality. Half of it sounded like Elvis Presley, the cultural lightning rod. The other half sounded like Elvis Presley, the movie star Hollywood was building. The Jordanaires helped smooth the divide. Their harmonies were immaculate, but they also diluted the rawness. The orchestration made the ballads feel cinematic, but also distant, like Elvis was performing from behind glass. Scotty and Bill were still there. But they weren't the core of the sound anymore. They were accompaniment. And here's what made it complicated. The music was good, professional, marketable. It would sell. Paramount knew it. RCA knew it. The Colonel knew it. But something was being traded away. And Elvis, at 22, surrounded by people who told him to trust the process, didn't fight back. He didn't know yet what he was giving up. February 8, 1957, the last recording session. They tracked "Teddy Bear." It was the simplest song on the album. A boy asking to be loved, offering nothing but sweetness in return. No edge, no danger, no sexuality. Just affection packaged for mass consumption. Elvis sang it perfectly. His voice was tender, controlled, emotionally present. He hit every mark. The Jordanaires blended seamlessly. The arrangement shimmered with warmth. It was a flawless performance, technically, professionally, commercially. But it was the furthest thing from Hound Dog. In the booth, the producers smiled. This was exactly what they needed. A song that would make parents comfortable. A song that would prove Elvis could be trusted with their daughter's record allowances. What they didn't say, what maybe they didn't even realize, was that they just recorded the blueprint for the next decade of Elvis's career. Teddy Bear would become a massive hit. It would top the Billboard pop chart for 7 weeks, sell over 1 million copies, become one of his most recognizable songs. By every commercial measure, it would prove that this version of Elvis, softer, safer, controlled, was the right call. But in that studio, as the final take played back, something had been set in motion. Not a mistake, not a failure, just a choice. Or maybe a choice being made for him. Elvis left radio recorders that day as the biggest star in America. But the wildness, the danger, the unpredictability that had made him a threat to the culture, it was being sanded down, not erased, not yet, just softened, packaged, made palatable. And once that process starts, it's very hard to reverse. Loving You premiered on July 9, 1957. The album followed days later. The film performed strongly. Audiences showed up. Teenage girls screamed during the musical numbers, just like Paramount hoped. Box office returns exceeded Love Me Tender. The studio was thrilled. Critics were less enthusiastic. Variety called it a handsomely mounted vehicle for the singer. A polite way of saying the movie existed to sell Elvis, not tell a story. The New York Times noted that the film seemed carefully designed to avoid offending anyone. That last part was true and intentional, but the album was a juggernaut. Teddy Bear dominated the summer of 1957, holding the #1 spot for 7 weeks. Loving You peaked at number 20. The full LP hit #1 on the Billboard album chart and stayed there for 10 weeks. RCA moved hundreds of thousands of copies. By every measurable metric, it was a triumph. But something in the music press began to shift. Critics who championed Elvis's raw early work started noticing the polish. The arrangements felt calculated. The energy, while still present, felt contained. A review in Downbeat praised the professionalism but noted, "Elvis Presley is still Elvis Presley, but he's starting to sound like someone else is telling him how." Most fans didn't care. They loved him regardless. But a subset, the ones who'd been drawn to the dangerous edge of That's All Right and Mystery Train, felt uneasy. They couldn't articulate it yet, but they sensed it. Something was different, and different didn't feel like progress. The success of Loving You locked Elvis into a pattern. Paramount greenlit a third film, then a fourth, then a contract for more. RCA pushed for soundtrack albums to accompany each one. The Colonel negotiated larger deals. The money flowed. The formula worked. And once a formula works in Hollywood, it repeats. But within Elvis's circle, fractures were forming. Scotty Moore and Bill Black, the men who'd been with him since the Sun Records days, were salaried employees. They watched Elvis earn millions while they received fixed paychecks. By late 1957, the resentment was boiling over. In September, they quit. Temporarily. They'd come back after the Colonel offered marginal raises, but the damage was done. The brotherhood that had defined Elvis's early sound was fractured. The music itself began to follow the Loving You template. Subsequent soundtracks, Jailhouse Rock later in 1957, King Creole in 1958, would contain flashes of brilliance, moments where Elvis's raw power broke through. But they were built to serve films first, music second, and then in March 1958, Elvis was drafted. 2 years in the U.S. Army. 2 years away from the studio, the stage, the culture he'd ignited. When he returned in 1960, rock and roll had evolved. The Beatles were forming, Bob Dylan was writing, the Stones were rehearsing in London. The culture Elvis had detonated was moving forward. And Elvis, locked into film contracts and soundtrack obligations, would spend the 1960s watching from the sidelines, making formulaic movies, recording bland soundtracks, still beloved, still famous, but no longer leading. Loving You didn't cause all of that. But it was the first domino. The first moment when success in one direction meant surrender in another. And by the time anyone realized, it was too late to turn back. For decades, Loving You was dismissed as a transitional album. Not essential, not groundbreaking, just a soundtrack, a commercial product, a stepping stone between the explosive debut and the later, more interesting work. But over time, critics started hearing it differently. Peter Guralnick, in his definitive Elvis biography Last Train to Memphis, highlighted the album's tension, the push and pull between artistry and commerce, between Elvis's instincts and Hollywood's demands. He noted that songs like Got a Lotta Livin' to Do and Mean Woman Blues proved Elvis still had fire, still had agency. But he also noted the pressure, the quiet erasure of spontaneity, the professionalization of rebellion. Music historian Greil Marcus wrote that Loving You was the sound of a revolutionary being turned into a product in real time. Others pointed to the title track itself as a quietly devastating performance. Elvis, at 22, singing with a vulnerability that would later be buried under layers of production and expectation. A tenderness he wouldn't be allowed to explore again for years. The album became a reference point for understanding Elvis's decline. Scholars analyzing his trajectory cite Loving You as the inflection point, the moment he chose, or was guided toward, safety over risk. In retrospect, it's not the album's weaknesses that matter. It's what the album reveals about the machinery around Elvis, the forces pulling him in directions he didn't fully understand, the quiet, professional dismantling of the very thing that made him dangerous. And in that context, Loving You becomes tragic. Not because it's bad, but because it's the moment we can hear him beginning to disappear. Loving You didn't influence rock and roll the way Sun Sessions or Elvis Presley did, but it influenced the industry. The album proved that film and music could be integrated for maximum profit, that a movie star could also drive album sales, that soundtracks weren't just promotional tools, they were revenue streams. Paramount's model spread. Other studios began courting rock and roll stars, offering film deals that promised fame and fortune, but demanded compromise. Cliff Richard in Britain, Frankie Avalon and Fabian in America. Most of those careers burned out fast. Most of those soundtracks are forgotten, but the template endured. Today, film soundtracks are billion-dollar industries. Artists like Beyoncé, Lady Gaga, and The Weeknd navigate the same tension Elvis faced in 1957. How do you serve the film without losing yourself? Some manage it, some don't. Loving You also casts a shadow over Elvis's own catalog. It marks the beginning of the drift, the slow, incremental transformation of a revolutionary into a commodity. There would be flashes of brilliance later, the 1968 comeback special, where Elvis reclaimed his danger for one blazing hour. The early 70s live performances in Vegas, where his voice reached new depths, but the arc was set in 1957. And once you're locked into that machinery, escape becomes exponentially harder. By the time Elvis realized what he'd traded away, the contracts were signed, the films were scheduled, the formula was profitable, and Hollywood doesn't let go of profitable. Loving You is not a masterpiece. It's not even Elvis's best work from 1957. That distinction probably belongs to Jailhouse Rock, recorded just months later. But Loving You matters because it captures a moment of transformation. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic failure. Just a quiet, professional reshaping. A series of small compromises that, stacked together, changed the trajectory of one of the most important artists in American history. The tragedy isn't that Elvis lacked talent. He had more than enough. The tragedy isn't that he lacked options. He was the biggest star in the world. The tragedy is that he was 22 years old, surrounded by people who saw him as a revenue stream, and he trusted them. And maybe that's the real lesson. Success doesn't always sound like success in the moment. Sometimes it sounds like a beautiful ballad, professionally recorded, commercially triumphant. Sometimes it sounds like people in suits telling you they know what's best. Sometimes it sounds like a door opening, toward money, toward Hollywood, toward a version of yourself that the world finds more acceptable. And sometimes, by the time you realize what you walked through, it's too late to walk back. Loving You is the sound of that door closing. 68 years later, it still sounds polished, beautiful, professional. And if you listen closely enough, past the strings, past the harmonies, past the commercial sheen, you can hear Elvis Presley beginning to vanish. Not all at once. Just enough that you know what's coming.